and anything up high with no loss of suction. Find out at dyson.com. .au DC44.
William Bosco had just returned from sea. Eager to see his new wife, he rushed home to this apartment complex. What he found inside horrified him. He ran next door to his neighbor, Daniel Williams.
William Bosco came over, beating on my door, yelling frantically that his wife was dead, and I grabbed my phone, called 911, and went to see how I could help.
The police arrived minutes later. There was no forced entry. The apartment was clean and tidy, except for the bedroom, where Michelle Moore Bosco had been brutally raped and murdered. To the police, it looked like a single assailant. Maureen Evans was the lead detective.
Within an hour and a half of discovering the body, Maureen Evans asked the victim's friend, Tamika Taylor, "What's your hunch? What does your gut tell you about who might have committed this crime?"
A young woman who lived in the complex had only known Michelle for a month. She pointed to the next-door neighbor.
Tamika Taylor told Detective Evans that they should look at Daniel Williams because it appeared that he seemed interested in the victim.
At the time of the murder, Daniel Williams was 25 and a machinist's mate in the Navy. He had been married for just 11 days. He and his wife Nicole had thought they were expecting a child when they found out to their dismay that she was suffering from ovarian cancer. His parents were visiting them from Michigan.
My parents and Nicole had gone to dinner, expecting me to join them shortly.
When we were leaving to go to dinner, they asked him to come down and to help sort out some of the information, to give him a few more answers. So we took separate cars, and he said that he would be joining us very shortly. Shortly turned into 2 hours, and then 3, and then 13 years.
Williams left the apartment and drove himself to the police station.
I expected to just answer some questions. Why was I the one to call 911 and not her husband? It was a half hour to 45 minutes into the questioning is when they started accusing me of raping and killing Michelle Bosco.
They wanted him to take a polygraph test. He agreed.
They told me that I had failed the polygraph test and that I needed to start telling the truth about what I did.
In fact, Daniel passed the test.
But the police didn't tell him that he passed the test. The police told him that he failed the lie detector test. And that really began an intense interrogation of Daniel that lasted for over 9 hours.
Being in a small room and you have a person sitting over across the table from you that's getting in your face, yelling at you, calling you a liar, poking you in the chest with their finger, and then turns around and says, well, I can help you if you tell me the truth. Tell me what happened. And it went on and on and on throughout the night with them calling me a liar, telling me that I needed to tell the truth. And I kept telling them, I am telling you the truth. I didn't do it.
The goal of an interrogation is to get a confession. That's the single overriding goal. Prior to an interrogation, police have made up their mind that the person is guilty. You don't interrogate somebody unless you first believe they're guilty.
Maureen Evans interrogated Daniel for over 8 hours, but she was not able to get Daniel to confess. And eventually, she gave way to another detective, Detective Ford, and he was a detective who had a reputation for getting people to confess.
Ford is a very intimidating person. He's not a big person, but he's like a bulldog. Once he gets his teeth into you, he doesn't stop until he gets what he wants from you. And that's what he did. He just kept relentlessly going at me throughout the night to get me to confess. And he got what he wanted. He got me to confess, even though it was a false confession.
Some people have very strong personalities and they will never break. And other people have very weak personalities, and most of us are somewhere in between. But what people who've never been interrogated have to understand is that interrogation can be very intense. A lot of psychological pressure, sometimes in a small space for a long period of time. People break sometimes in response to that pressure, and they think the only way to save themselves is to put an end to that interrogation.
At the end of the day, and confessions could go for over 24 hours. You will have sleep deprivation, your subject will be hungry, but probably doesn't even want to eat. You know, so you are taking them into another situation. So many people say, well, how could you confess to a crime that you never did? Well, I'll tell you something. Put them in a room with me. I could do it. You know, I'm going to be asking you, are you deaf? You're not deaf, right?
No.
No. Well, talk louder. I'm asking you a question. Are you deaf?
No.
Okay. Now, you want to go to jail? You want to get the death penalty? Or you want me to help you out?
Of course I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to get the death penalty.
So? Then tell me what the hell happened there, and I'll help you out. But don't look at me like that. We're sitting here 10 damn hours. How much longer are we going to do this?
I don't know.
You don't know? Well, it's up to you. Don't tell me you don't know. You failed the polygraph, so you're not going to tell me you didn't do it. We're going to go here all night. You're not leaving this room. Now you want to get...
Daniel Williams confessed after 11 hours of interrogation.
I got her in the back room and I forced her to have intercourse with me. She resisted and I hit her a couple of times with my hand. I grabbed a flat, hard shoe and I struck her with it, and then I got up and left.
The problem was that the confession that Daniel gave was completely inconsistent with the facts of the crime.
The first thing they should have done is understood the crime that they were investigating. They didn't even know the results of the autopsy. For example, Williams said he'd beaten her with a shoe, denied choking her, denied using any sort of a weapon, when in fact she was not beaten. And she was choked, and there was a weapon used. She was stabbed.
Overnight, Detective Evans received the autopsy report. Michelle was not hit with a shoe or anything else. She was stabbed and strangled. The detective rushed back to Daniel to question him some more.
She started questioning me more about it, and she had at one point demonstrated on herself and where Michelle was stabbed at in her chest.
Daniel got the message and amended his confession.
I started looking around for something and I saw a knife. I picked it up and I stabbed her about 3 times.
Detective Evans then asked Daniel what he did next.
I got up, I dropped the weapon, and I went out.
They came back and had him readjust, and oh yeah, I think I might have touched her throat, and he couldn't describe the knife, but he might have stabbed her, and these sorts of things. And they were satisfied. No concern about multiple offenders. They were convinced they'd solved the crime.
Daniel was charged with rape and murder less than 24 hours after the body was discovered.
When Daniel called us to tell us that he was arrested, he just kept saying he didn't do it. And they wouldn't believe him, and he wanted to come home to be with Nicole, and but they wouldn't let him come home.
Close one.
Probably really sank in after that, you know, I messed up. I should have stood my ground.
All during the interrogation, Daniel Williams never used his right to ask for a lawyer.
I think it's a prejudice most of us have, that if you were innocent, you don't need to call for a lawyer, because innocence is its own defense. Innocent can defend itself. And if you call for a lawyer, it looks a little bit sleazy. It looks as if you've got something to hide and need a professional at the law to help you hide it. The trouble with that is that innocence can't defend itself against a really clever interrogation.
Why in the world would you want an attorney now? We're sitting here 10 hours. You're almost there. You get an attorney, then I'm going to have to lock you up for the capital murder. So why did you put in 10 hours? Let's finish it up, then we'll get you your attorney.
By the time Daniel realized what he had done, it was too late.
It was just unimaginable to myself at that point. But I had confessed, and I knew the confession wasn't true. But it was a confession.
At that point, the police closed their investigation. They had arrested the person they thought had committed the crime, and they didn't investigate the case anymore. They thought they had arrested the one person who had committed this crime.
The case was closed, and weeks went by. Detective Maureen Evans left the force for another job. Detective Ford was dealing with other cases. Then, 4 months later, startling news. The results of Daniel's DNA were back, and they did not match the semen left at the crime scene.
Now they had a choice to make. Either Williams was not guilty of this, was not involved in a crime scene, or he had to be part of some sort of weird conspiracy.
Instead of objectively looking at the case and his involvement in figuring out what does the DNA tell us, they assumed he still had to have been involved, but there had to have been somebody else.
They kept the DNA results secret and went looking for Daniel's accomplice. They picked his roommate, a fellow sailor on the USS Saipan. His name was Joe Dick, Jr.
When I heard he confessed, it's just something that was hard to believe. It's like I know he couldn't have done it because he had just married Nicole, and he loved Nicole. So basically a shock to me and the guys that he worked with.
Family members say he was a shy and sensitive kid, raised in a working-class neighborhood in Baltimore, protected by loving parents. Joe Dick was socially awkward. He had struggled both in school and in the Navy. He had always been a loner.
Joe Dick is one of the most interesting people involved in this case, and I think key to understanding this case. His confession stands out because he came to believe that he must have been involved in this crime.
To this day, I still blame myself. It's an experience that will never leave me. There are some things that I won't talk about, not because I'm ashamed of it, but because I just don't want to talk about it.
He would become the most important witness in the case. 6 months after the murder, Naval Security turned Joe over to the Norfolk Police. Detective Glenn Ford was waiting for him.
They started asking me where I was when this happened, and I told them that I was on the ship. Ford's saying I'm lying. He's starting to get ticked off. He's raising his voice. He keeps coming back with, "We know you were there, we can prove you were there. You can't get the death penalty." I kept denying it. We went and did a polygraph. He comes back with the results, and he says I'm still lying, that I failed the polygraph.
The results of this polygraph test have never been released.
Eventually, I just wanted to tell him anything to get him off my back, to shut him up. I was tired, emotionally, mentally, worn down.
Then Ford showed Joe a photograph of the dead victim.
She was laying there, and she had on this black t-shirt. I just looked at it.
The photograph appears to have traumatized Joe. It also fed him information that only the perpetrator would have known. After hours of interrogation, he finally told them, he said, what they wanted to hear.
I told him that I was there and that Danny was there. He would ask, are you sure that it happened in the living room and not the bedroom? Didn't it happen like this, or didn't it happen like that? Just to get the story he wants.
Then for a minute, he had hope.
And when I'm in the interrogation room, Ford said, "We know that you were there and we can prove it. All we need is some DNA." I'm like, "Sure, go ahead, take it." Because I knew for a fact that DNA wouldn't be there. And I gave him 2 vials of blood and samples of hair from the top of my head. Anything they wanted. And this was the only thing I was happy about all day. Knowing that, yeah, I've got them. They ain't going to be there. I'm going to be walking out that front door. They're going to have to drop them charges. Joke was on me. They didn't drop them. They kept them charges in place and put me in prison.
Once again, they would arrest a suspect, confident that the DNA would eventually prove them right.
In the mind of the investigator and the prosecutor, they're the good guys. They would not put an innocent person in jail. They would not prosecute an innocent person. And because they put these people in jail, they just have to believe that they're guilty. It's this sort of circular, it's self-validating sort of mentality that goes on that just ignores all of the evidence.
Pat and Joe did.
Think about this. With an all-new, more powerful 1.6-litre turbo engine, the Holden Cruise SRIV is built here and made exciting. And to prove it, we went to one of the people behind its MyLink infotainment system. We asked her to use the built-in music app Pandora to find a relaxing song, and then tested to see just how relaxed she could stay. To see what happened, search for Cruise Test. Think 1.6 litre turbo engine. Think New Cruise SRIV. Think Holden.
Public lighting accounts for about a third of the city's electricity use. The City of Sydney will be the first city in Australia to roll out LED lighting of this scale.
LED technology will transform lighting as we know it, saving up to 75% energy. This will have a profound impact on how we think about lighting in the future.
We have worked really closely with GE. There's going to be enormous benefits, we believe, for the people of Sydney. We're putting something in place for generations to come.
Pat and Joe Dick Sr., Joe's parents, live in Maryland. She's a court stenographer, and he's a retired military man.
I came in from work one day, and the phone was ringing, and I picked it up. It was the captain of the USS Saipan, and he told me that my son had been arrested. And I told him, I says, Joseph Dick Jr., I says, do you have the right child? I says, not, my son wouldn't be arrested for something like that. And he said, no, he said, it was definitely, you know, my son, there was no mistake.
That evening, Joe called us at home, and he said to me, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. And I told Joe, I said, well, you know, we understand. Believe me, I know that you couldn't ever been party to something like this. And I said, why are you still there? He said, well, I just told them what they wanted to hear. And that's when the terror set in. And I said, you didn't sign anything, did you? Well, yeah, I signed a confession. And I said, we'll be down first thing in the morning.
They drove to Norfolk. At the jail, a man handed them the business card of a lawyer named Michael Fasanaro. Fasanaro, a veteran Navy lawyer, said he was willing to represent their son for $22,000, a bargain for a complex death penalty trial. They left to take a mortgage out on their home, leaving their son's case in Fasanaro's hands.
The attorney felt that I was guilty from day one.
I certainly thought he was guilty. The client told me he was guilty. He had confessed to the police, and then he told me he was involved.
It's like he gave up from the first day and didn't even try to give me an adequate defense.
Joe was facing the death penalty. The Commonwealth approached me and asked me whether or not he might be interested in testifying in behalf of the Commonwealth. In return, they would take the death penalty off the case, off the table. I approached Mr. Dick about it. I approached his parents about it. Based upon the evidence, based upon the personality of the client that I had, I considered that if we went to trial, the death penalty was a legitimate possibility.
Whatever he thought, Fasanaro's biggest problem was Joe Dick's confession, a problem shared by Daniel Williams' court-appointed lawyer, Danny Shipley.
No one in Virginia believes that you confessed to a murder you didn't commit. No one believes it. And that's true of judges, true of lawyers. No one believes it. And they'll tell you again and again, I don't believe someone confesses to a murder they didn't commit. And that's what I'm looking at. And to be quite frank with you, when you approach a case, how are we going to handle this case? Are we going to try to make a deal? Are we going to go to court and try the case? Death changes everything. Death, all of your decisions that you make are guided by the fact that if you make the wrong decision, you make the wrong call, your client's dead.
In Virginia.
In Virginia, your client's dead. Okay, we're very, very good at killing people, executing people. We're in the top 2 or 3 every year.
Any hope Joe had that his DNA would save him was dashed.
My attorney came to me one day, told me my DNA didn't match, and I knew that it wasn't going to match. I knew that it wasn't there. And I'm figuring, okay, I gave them my DNA, even though I confessed. They got to kick me loose, because that proves right there I didn't do this. But that's not their thinking. They don't care. My attorney told me that there had to be somebody else, and if I cooperate, he can get me a better plea bargain.
It was in his best interest to try and cooperate the best he could to take the death penalty off the case, because I was convinced with the brutality of this murder, a jury might very well have given the death penalty.
One day, Mr. Fasanero called here and said, "I've got some bad news for you. I hate to tell you, but your son is guilty. He was involved in every bit of this crime from start to finish." And I just stood there with my mouth open, because up to that point, we always believed our son was innocent, never had any doubt. But now we've got the guy that we're paying to defend him telling us we got a problem. You know, and he's telling us he's guilty, he was there for every aspect of the crime, he could get the death penalty, we need a plea bargain, and my job now is to save his life.
Because he said everything hinged on the confession, and there was absolutely no way that they could get past the confession.
He advised them to urge Joe to tell the truth and name others who were involved.
He says, urge upon him the importance of, you know, cooperate and just tell the truth. So, of course, you know, Joe happens to call up and we're talking to him and I try and press upon him. You know, Mr. Fasanero says, you have to tell the truth, Joe. It's really important that you tell the truth, you know, and that'll help you maybe get a better deal or you know, get the death penalty off or something like that. And, you know, so like we have become part of the problem.
I went ahead and listened to her. Because coming from Mom, it made sense. Coming from my attorney, it just sounded like sheer lunacy. Why would I take a plea bargain if I know I'm innocent?
Urged by his lawyer and his parents, Joe tried hard to protect his plea by giving the prosecution what he thought they wanted to hear.
You just made it up?
I just made it up. Just telling them what they wanted to hear. When the truth of the matter is that everything I told them is their version of the facts, which is a straight up lie.
One of Joe's statements involved a young Navy man, a friend of the wife of Daniel Williams, named Eric Wilson.
Well, I got involved in the case because of Joseph Dick. He had, for reasons of his own, decided to tell the police officers that I was involved. And as soon as I got back off my Mediterranean cruise, I was arrested and brought in.
Do you know why he did it?
No. No, I don't know why he did it.
Were you friends?
I knew him. I knew Joseph. I wouldn't really call us friends, but I did know him.
And that was enough for the police to arrest Eric.
How many statements did you make? Do you remember?
3 or 4.
How about 7?
7. I think it was a total of 7 statements.
How many were true?
None of those statements that were made were true.
He was making up stuff.
I couldn't tell you what was made up because I wasn't there. I had to rely on my client.
Fasanero gave Joe mixed signals. Joe could tell all the stories he wanted, but he had to tell the truth.
I didn't recommend against his continuing on and cooperating with the authorities. I thought it was in his best interest.
To continue?
To cooperate, of course.
Even though he kept changing the stories?
Well, if they were willing to accept his changes to the stories and it was going to benefit Mr. Dick, then by all means continue, but try and tell the truth.
Often, the attorney didn't accompany Joe to his sessions with Ford or the prosecution.
I didn't need to be there. Joe was already committed. And again, my position in these things is that my presence could hinder Joe more than help him. It's up to him. Once the decision is made that you're going to cooperate, Mr. Dick, then you, Mr. Dick, have got to continue to sell yourself. If I'm there and you're looking for me to give you answers with a nod on my head or a shake on my head or something, that destroys everything. You've agreed this is what you want to do, go do it.
After months in jail, depressed and confused, Joe began to believe the police theories.
After giving the detectives the names that they wanted, it became a natural thought to me that I did this.
Joe's growing belief in his guilt would prove crucial for the case. Then, 2 months after his arrest, Eric Wilson's DNA came back negative. So Detective Ford went back to Joe to ask for new names. As usual, Joe complied. He gave a new statement in which he claimed that there were 3 other men involved. 2 whose names he didn't know, and 1 who he named George Clark.
Did you know George Clark?
No, I didn't know George Clark, but I knew Derek, and that's who it turned out to be.
The police couldn't find a George Clark, but the description and resulting police sketch looked somewhat like Derek Tice.
A friend of ours said, well, there's a guy named Derek that was on the George Washington in the Navy. So they got a cruise book from the George Washington, showed it to Joe. He flipped through it, saw me, said, yeah, that's the guy.
Derek was another friend of Daniel. He was arrested in Florida and taken to Norfolk, Virginia for questioning.
The only thing I knew of that I had ever done in Virginia that was breaking the law was a speeding ticket. And I'll go up to Virginia and get it straightened out, pay the ticket, and be back home in a week.
Didn't come out that way?
No, it was 11 years, 1 month, and 18 days later I walked out of prison. So didn't happen the way I wanted it to.
Derek remembers learning of the charges against him.
My legs just turned to jelly. I couldn't think. I didn't know where I was. It was, getting hit upside the head with a 2x4. It was about like that. I was dazed and confused.
He too was taken to the interrogation room to face Glenn Ford.
Ford, he postured like a bulldog, leaning towards me, yelling at me, calling me a liar, telling me I was going to die. And this went on for 8 hours. I keep telling him I didn't know anything about the crime. I wasn't there, but he had in his mind what he thought was the truth, and until I said what he wanted me to say, I wasn't getting out of that room.
A few hours into the interrogation, Derek, like the others, was given a polygraph test, the results of which, again, have never been released. After the test, Derek told the investigator that he had decided to stop talking unless he could see a lawyer.
I was taken back to the interrogation room, and within 13 minutes, in walked Detective Ford and Ray, and he had the cat that ate the canary smile on his face and said, "Told you you were guilty. Told you you failed," and started right back in on the interrogation.
What happened to the lawyer?
There was no lawyer, no nothing, and at that moment when he came back in and started the interrogation, my mind, because of him coming in like that, just froze. It was like in total shock. And so, you know, he started the interrogation up again, and you know, eventually I broke and gave him what he wanted to hear.
After 11 hours, he signed a confession.
Yes, yes.
Alan Zaleski was Derek's court-appointed lawyer. He has practiced criminal law for 40 years.
How did he explain this confession?
He said that it was 8 hours of constant talk, constant telling him he's lying, telling him that he should tell the truth, that kind of business. It's not very satisfactory to me. It's hard to accept that that is a reasonable explanation. You might ask him why he did. Why did he sign a statement saying he committed these murdered a woman, raped a woman, stabbed her and everything? Why would you do that if you didn't do it?
At least every, I'd say 30 seconds, Ford was saying, you keep saying you weren't there, you keep lying to us, you're going to die, you're going to get the needle. How does it feel to die? And after the 9 hours, my thinking was, my only options are tell him a lie, tell him what he wants to hear and live, or keep telling the truth and die.
They were threatened. They were all threatened with the death penalty. They were told they would receive the death penalty if they didn't confess, and the only way to avoid the death penalty was if they stopped denying and started admitting to what the interrogators believed they had done.
If you go back in history to the Inquisition, for instance, which had very elaborate protocols of torture, when you could torture, if someone made a confession under torture, he'd have to repeat it without torture 24 hours later. On the other hand, if he recanted it, then you torture him again. But one of the stages in applying torture was known as showing the instruments, and lots of victims confess just at seeing the instruments that would be used on them. I think I would have. And I think in the case of the Norfolk Four, the way the detective used the death penalty was very much like showing the instruments.
To help us understand what it was like to be confronted by Ford and the threat of death, Derek said he'd try to show what the interrogation was like.
All right, Derek, let's start again. What happened that night?
I was at home and a friend called me and told me to watch television. And
No. Quit. Right there. You're lying, Derek.
No.
No, you were there. You committed this crime, Derek. What you did was sickening. I've lived this case since its beginning. It's been my life.
No.
I know there was a party at Dan's house, and you went. Nicole got a headache, and she went to bed. Y'all started talking about girls, decided to go over to Michelle's apartment. Somebody knocked on the door. Somebody covered the peephole with their thumb. Y'all went in and you raped and killed this girl. I know you did it.
I'm telling you the truth.
No, you're not telling me the truth, Derek. You're just a liar, and you're going to die. You deserve to die. I'm sorry. That's it. I can't. I can't do any more. I'm sorry. I hope that was enough. I can't.
It's a very difficult thing to explain to someone who hasn't been there. I felt caged, and I was scared, and I didn't know what to do.
8.5 hours he was like that. Just never calming down, never.
he physically, emotionally wore me down to the point where I just couldn't go anymore. And I just told him what he wanted to hear.
My fear was not of what would happen next. It was of Ford. He does not appear that imposing. But in the interrogation room, it's different. It's just different. They told me what they wanted to hear, and I repeated it back to them. Everything I said was scripted by Ford. All the details I gave about the apartment were because of photos he showed me of the crime scene. I was so mentally, emotionally drained by them that I didn't care what the truth was. I was willing to tell them whatever they wanted to hear just to make them stop.
The confession, Derek said, was carefully crafted.
It was an hour and a half to 2 hours of rehearsal of going over this statement over and over and over again, adding a piece here, adding a piece there, until it was a big enough story that Ford liked, and he was like, okay, then once we got that, we had to go back over it 3 more times just to make sure that I had all the parts and pieces together. And then he goes, okay, now we're going to record it. When the rest of us got inside, we disrobed her, held her down. I had one leg, Eric had the other leg. It was just so not me. It was a robot. Dan was the first to have intercourse with her. I was the second. Eric was third. What I said, I didn't know until I got a copy of it and read it. I couldn't remember what I had said. Dan started to strangle her to keep her from talking, and so made the statement that just get a knife and stab her. Then Dan stabbed her, I stabbed her, then Eric stabbed her, Joe stabbed her.
There was no record of what led to the confession.
The police didn't turn the tape on until they were ready to have the full confession. In other words, we were not provided with, because there was no evidence of, no record of, what had occurred for the 10, 12, 15 hours, I can't remember exactly how much now, but the numerous hours that occurred prior to that time, in terms of the confessions where he denied, where he said, I wasn't involved, I wasn't there. How'd they get him from point A to point Z? We don't know, because it wasn't taped.
Since Joe did.
Think about this. With an all-new, more powerful 1.6-litre turbo engine, the Holden Cruise SRIV is built here and made exciting. And to prove it, we went to one of the people behind its MyLink infotainment system. We asked her to use the built-in music app Pandora to find a relaxing song, and then tested to see just how relaxed she could stay. To see what happened, search for Cruise Test. Think 1.6-litre turbo engine. Think new Cruise SRIV. Think Holden.